Okay, so I am Jessica. Today I'll be talking about some work I did while I was an intern at Twitter called the effect of recommendations on network structure, otherwise known as who to follow, what happened to the Twitter graph. So, sorry. This is not my computer. So, recommendation systems, you can find them all over the internet. You know, Amazon recommends books, Netflix recommends movies, and so on and so forth. And the effects of recommendation systems, you could say they're pretty straightforward, because if you're the user, you just get access to better products, and if you're the company, you get more engagement and more money. But fewer people have discussed the effect that recommender systems have on the overall structure of the marketplace. For example, let's take Yelp as an example. You could say, well, Yelp always recommends me new restaurants, so it stands to reason that it would increase marketplace diversity, in the sense that it will always expose you to new hole-in-the-wall restaurants that nobody would have heard of otherwise. But if you're actually a restaurant on Yelp, you might be like, oh no, Yelp actually only supports popular restaurants. It just makes restaurants that already have a lot of traffic, are already very highly rated. It just shows those higher in search results and everyone else kind of gets left out. So we can answer similar questions about Twitter. And the recommendation system at Twitter is kind of special because it recommends people and not necessarily products. So Twitter has this who to follow system. If you want, you can click on it recommends all these 3 people to follow, and if you're into that sort of thing, you can click follow. So we can ask very similar questions to the questions that we asked about Yelp. Like we could ask, well, who exactly benefits from who to follow? Who is shown in the who to follow system? Is it going to be the people who are already very popular, like Justin Bieber? Or is it going to be like just people like you and me who have less than 500 followers on Twitter? And at the same time, you can also ask things like, well, what kinds of relationships are actually happening on Twitter? Is it like friendships? Are you going to make new friends through who to follow? Or are you going to just make unreciprocated ties, like the ties that you might make to Justin Bieber? So these are the effects of recommendations on network structure. And the most interesting part of that title is actually the word effect, because it's actually really, really hard to measure the effect of anything on anything unless you do a real experiment. So you know correlation does not imply causation, and if you want to actually measure a causal effect of A on B, then what you want to do is you want to have like a treatment and a control group, and you want to manipulate A and see what changes you make in B. So running experiments on networks is actually really hard, and why is that? Well, you know, in your standard experiments, you have like a treatment group and a control group, and you might give like one type of drug to a treatment group and a placebo to the control group, and you might see what is the difference between the 2 groups. But in network experiments, that's actually really hard to do, because if you apply one treatment to one side of the network, then what those users do is going to actually affect users on the other side of the network too. So it's actually impossible to split people up like that. So what are we going to do if we can't run an experiment? Well, the answer that we use is to run a natural experiment. And July 30th, 2010 was a very special day for the who to follow team at Twitter, because it was the day that the who to follow system was first launched. And the interesting natural experiment that we can look at is we can look at the 2 weeks that happened before the who to follow system was introduced, and we can look at the network structure at that time. And then we look at what happened in the 2 weeks after the who to follow system was introduced, and we look at the network structure then, and we reason that because the time window is so short, any difference between the 2 weeks before and the 2 weeks after must be due to the who to follow system itself. So any difference in network structure should be random except for the ones caused by who to follow. So now we have this natural experiment. Are people clear on this?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so what exactly did we find? What results did this natural experiment show? And first of all, yes, there is an effect. The who to follow system did encourage more people to follow more people, which I think was kind of the point. And that is a good thing. And you can see this graph here. It shows this gray line, shows the number of new follows that happened on Twitter each day. And this is right around the introduction of the recommender system. Like I said, July 30th was the day it was rolled out, and there's like this 1-week rollout period that's delimited between these 2 black dotted lines. And this gray line here shows the number of new follows that are being added each day. You see there are peaks on Mondays through Fridays when everybody is procrastinating on their work. And this dark black line here is the weekly average. So, and you see, around the time the recommender system was introduced, there's actually this huge boost it starts with about 7.7 million people are following each other every day, but after the recommender system was introduced, it gets increased to 9.5 million, and that is a huge effect. But the question we want to ask is, who was benefiting from that? Was it the people who were already very popular? Are those mostly the people who are getting followed? Or is it the people like you and me, the everyman? And it turns out the answer is both. So you see, even very unpopular people, they still see an increase in the amount of followers they get a day, but the very popular people see an even larger increase. And let me explain what these numbers mean. What happened was we divided the people on Twitter into several different buckets based on how many followers they had. So and we bin them logarithmically so that there are some people with 10 to 99 followers, and those are that point, and there are people with 100K to 1 million followers, and that's that point. And what we did was we looked at how many followers these people got in the 2 weeks before the introduction of the who to follow system, and we also looked at how many followers they got in the 2 weeks after the introduction of the recommender system. And we found the difference between these two numbers, the percent difference. And it turns out that for people with low followers, you get about a 20% boost in your follower growth rate. And for people with a lot of followers, you get about a 50% boost in your follower growth rate, which is a huge difference. And you can see that everybody sees an increase in follower growth, but the popular people benefit by far the most. And the question is, why? Why do the rich get richer? So there are two reasons. One of them is more interesting than the other. The less interesting reason is that users simply respond better to more popular users. So if Justin Bieber appears in your who to follow system, then you are about 3 times more likely to click follow on him than you would on a normal user. I have no idea why, but anyway. There's the other reason is there's a subtle interplay between the dynamics of the recommender and the natural evolution of the network, and we are about to get into that. So the recommender system is kind of balanced in the sense that the more followers you have, the more often you are shown in who to follow. And actually, the relation is very close to linear. So if you have 1,000 followers, you are going to be shown in who to follow about 10 times as often as somebody who has only 100 followers. And this plot kind of shows that. This is the number of times you're shown in who to follow divided by the number of followers you have. So the fact that it's almost a flat line kind of shows that you almost get your impressions are proportional to the popularity that you already have. And if you actually assume a certain model of a recommender system, you can actually prove this fascinating result. So the type of recommender that we're assuming is a friend of friend recommender. And what that means is the way that Twitter will recommend you someone is, let's say a lot of your friends are following Donald Trump. Then they think, well, maybe you are also likely to follow Donald Trump, so you recommend Donald Trump to me. And the reverse of this is, say that if you have if you want to find a recommendation for me, you would first choose one of my friends at random, and then you would choose one of my friend's friends at random, and then recommend that person to me. So the potential pool of recommendations is people who are 2 hops away from me. And the more 2 hop paths there are between me and the friends, the more likely those people are to be recommended to me. And it turns out that if you have this sort of friend-to-friend recommender and you run it on a certain type of random graph, then you get exactly that figure that we were just showing you, where the number of times you're recommended is proportional to how many friends you already have. So there's that. But that by itself should not be enough to explain why the rich get richer. Because if you look at standard models of network growth, such as preferential attachment, those predict that even without the recommender boost, you should be gaining followers at a rate that is proportional to how many followers you already have. And that is actually not really supported by our data. It turns out that in our data, people don't actually gain followers naturally at a rate that is proportional to their current follower count. So if we look at this figure, let me explain this figure to you very carefully. So here we have 2 lines. One of them represents people's growth rates after the recommender was introduced. We're going to ignore that line completely. And the other line represents people's growth rates before the recommender was introduced. And what do we mean by growth rate? We mean that if you have 1,000 followers, your daily growth rate is 0.3%. That means you gain 3 followers a day. And if you have 1 million followers, your daily growth rate is 0.1%, so you gain 10,000 followers a day. And you see that as you as you go up in popularity, your daily growth rate actually decreases. Even though you're gaining more followers in absolute numbers, your relative growth rate decreases. So you see that actually people gain followers at a rate that's like sublinear in their number of followers, which is kind of interesting. And if this were linear, like the recommender boost, this dotted line would be flat because everybody would have like a 0.1% daily growth rate across the board. Do people understand?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, great. So there's a sublinear growth, and why does the sublinear growth happen? Well, we think it's because there's some network overlap. So generally, your potential pool of potential new followers is the people who follow the people who are following you. Because let's say that I tweet something and one of my followers retweets me, then people discover me by looking at that retweet. So those are the people who are following the people. So basically, your pool of potential followers is the people who are 2 hops away from you in the follow graph. And it turns out that this 2-hop neighborhood grows sublinearly as a function of how many followers you actually have. So you see this little curve that goes this way. The number of followers, it grows sublinearly in the number of people you actually have. And that's because it's possible for your potential followers to be following 2 or more of your followers. So we have that sublinear growth. So the natural rate of growth in general is sublinear in this network, but the recommender itself, who to follow, displays people linearly related to how many followers you have. So the fact that we put together this sublinear growth with a linear recommender boost, and we get that the linear boost disproportionately favors people who have more followers. So let's take an example. Let's say that the natural growth rate is sublinear in the number of followers, so your d followers dt is the square root of the number of followers you have. That means that naturally, if you have 100 followers, you're going to gain 10 followers a day, and if you have 10,000 followers, you're going to gain 100 followers a day. Now, why don't we add a linear recommender boost on top of that? So that's f over 10. Then, well, if you have 100 followers, then your growth rate goes from 10 followers a day to 20 followers a day. And if you have 10,000 followers, your growth rate goes from 100 followers a day to 1,100 followers a day. And that is a huge jump. The linear boost definitely disproportionately favors people who are already very popular. So that is why. And let me reiterate once again that people are much more likely to click follow on you if you are already very popular. So Justin Bieber, who's in this 10 million bucket, you're about 3 times as likely to hit that follow button on him than you would be if you hit the follow button on me. So that is basically the explanation, but there's a couple of other structural changes I would like to talk to you about in this Twitter network. And first thing we want to know is what kind of connections exactly are being formed on who to follow. So are people, basically, we know that people are following new people, but are they following people who are kind of outside of their comfort zone, or are they following people who are already kind of in their community who they probably would have discovered anyway? And that question can be answered if we answer the question of, do new edges close triangles? And the second question that we want to ask is, are people actually making friends on who to follow, or are they mostly making unreciprocated fan connections, like if you just follow Justin Bieber and he never follows you back? And that question can be reduced to, are new edges reciprocated? So now I'm going to show you the answers. The answer is that yes, more edges do close triangles. The graph does become more tightly connected. And you can see that because before the introduction of the recommender system, 71.6% of edges were closing triangles, and afterwards it went up to 74.5, which does not seem like a huge difference, but on the Twitter scale it is. And you'll see that, more strikingly, the median number of triangles closed by any given edge goes from 5 to 7, which does seem like a very striking difference. But despite this, people are not really making friends, because the fraction of new edges that are eventually reciprocated drops from 38% to 36%. And that is all I have to say. Thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
First of all, let's thank the speakers for the very vibrant discussion, presentation. Are there any questions?
Very question and presentation. Thank you. More content question. In recommenders, it's known that rich get richer is not a good trend.
Yes.
Is this also not a good trend in case of Twitter?
Well, it depends on what your goals are, I guess. So
as the company system.
I'm not actually sure what Twitter's goals are here. I guess Twitter could be trying to increase diversity, but they could also just be trying to optimize for what the users most want to see. So maybe if the rich gets richer, maybe it's no problem to them, but I don't really know. I can't really speak for the company. Thank you for your question. What's up?
Really interesting talk. Can you comment a bit on like the time dynamics of some of these phenomena? So when Justin Bieber first joins Twitter, he might be receiving followers at a much greater rate that tapers off because everyone on Twitter who wants to follow him has followed him. And then the same is like the effect of the time dynamics of the who to follow feature.
That is a really interesting question, and it is not a question that I completely know the answer to. I know that there are some models of network growth that say that you should basically gain followers kind of in proportion to how many followers you already have, but as we were saying here, like your growth rate is actually sublinear in the number of followers you have, so maybe it kind of slows down after a while. So, but it's not a question I completely know the answer to.
Thanks.
What's up?
Have you tried looking maybe slightly more than 2 weeks into the future to see if it tapers off or if it remains on the same level of new edges?
Ah, that is a very interesting question. We actually have a slide about that showing exactly what happens after the window of observation. And yes, it turns out that it does end up kind of tapering off and having all these little random peaks and valleys that are completely unrelated to the introduction of the recommendation system, because you see, after you expand the window of observation, you can't really assume anything causal about who to follow anymore, because that was like the basis of the natural experiment.
So is the analysis independent of the recommendation algorithm, or it's actually if I have a different ranking algorithm, which says just saying that I should suggest user who have less followers?
I think if we have a different recommendation algorithm, then the model would certainly be different, right?
Yeah.
So we wouldn't be able to assume it was a friend of friend. We wouldn't be able to prove that this result should hold, but we could still do like the exact same empirical analysis and hopefully get kind of similar results.
Can I ask also a question? Probably I have missed something because I had to get out for a few minutes. I understand that you make an assumption that looking for triangles means reciprocity.
Oh, well, I guess those are actually two different questions. So like, I guess actually
I mean, basically I would like to understand what is the meaning or what's the intuition behind the triangle search here.
Okay, so I guess the fact that we're closing more triangles after the recommendation system was introduced, it kind of makes sense because the recommendation system, we assume, just recommends your friends of friends. So if it's just recommending people who are 2 hops away from you, then it makes sense that the new followers are going to close triangles.
Mm-hmm.
But it also makes sense that the edges are not going to be reciprocated, because if it mostly recommends popular people, then you just follow the popular people, they're not going to follow you back. So actually, both of these are connected to the dynamics of the recommender.
Great. Are there any other questions? No? So let's thank the speaker again. And I think we should give extra credits because she was the last speaker of a very long day.